Hello dear viewer, today I will take you on a journey to Oblivion, the part of the Elder Scrolls saga that is quite precious to me, and back in the day, its main story sparked a discussion about dumbing down the storytelling aspect of video game. Of course it did, nothing new here. Some players thought it was inferior to Morrowind's main story, some were complaining about the story being too black and white, good versus evil, while I also believe Morrowind had the best writing in the entire saga. I certainly don't think it being about good versus evil conflict is a problem at all. Todd Howard himself admitted that in the creative process he was heavily influenced by the Lord of the Rings movies, and that shows in the aesthetics, language, and storytelling choices. In the context of the Elder Scrolls lore, the story isn't just about good and evil, by the way, as the main antagonist, the Daedric Lord Mehrunes Dagon, isn't just a lord of the destruction, but also of change and revolution. I will assume that most of you know the story already, so I am not going to retell it here. If you would like to refresh your memory, a link to a brief overview of the storyline is in the description. Obviously, if you never played Oblivion, there will be spoilers. You are warned. Let's maybe start with the good versus evil issue, as very few video game enemies are so obviously evil as the baddies in this one. Visually, the realm of Mehrunes Dagon looks like the most obvious representation of hell you can possibly imagine. And he himself is referred to as the enemy with a capital E in multiple dialogue lines. The enemy is how the Dark Lord Sauron is nicknamed in the Lord of the Rings, and that comes from Arthurian legendarium of High Middle Ages, where it is the nickname of Satan himself, and in fact it is one of the possible translations of the ancient Hebrew word Hasatan. On the side of the good guys we have Martin Septim, a servant of the protective and benevolent Aedra Akatosh, the god of time. The broader context of this conflict can be understood better if you read the in-game book The Monomyth. All Tamrielic religions begin the same, men or mer. Things begin with the dualism of Anu and his other. These twin forces go by many names: Anu Padome, Aniel Sithis, Ak-El Satak Akel, is not. Anuel is the everlasting, ineffable light. Sithis is the corrupting, inexpressible action. In any case, from these two beings spring the Et Ada, or the original spirits. To humans, these Et Ada are gods and demons. To the Aldmer, the Aedra Daedra, or the ancestors. All of the Tamrielic pantheons fill their rosters with these Et Ada, though divine membership often differs from culture to culture. Like Anu and Padome, every one of these pantheons contains the archetypes of the dragon god and the missing god. Before I go any further, can I just make a side note? The term just used here, as well as the title of the book, The Monomyth, come from a real-life school of literary criticism and psychology. Archetypes are part of the Carl Jung's psychology theory, and monomyth is the term cooked up by Joseph Campbell, whose book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is a study in comparative mythology, influenced many writers and filmmakers. The term monomyth is used in that book to describe the basic structure of all known heroic stories from all over the world. To some degree, if you want to try and write a convincing fantasy world, you better read some Campbell. If nothing else, this real-life parallel shows that the Elder Scrolls writers know what they are doing. But let's proceed with the Dragon God. The Dragon God is always related to time, and is universally revered as the first god. He is often called Akatosh, whose purge from eternity allowed the day. He is the central god of the Cyrodiilic Empire. The missing god is always related to the mortal plane, and is a figure in human Aldmeri schism. The missing refers to either his palpable absence from the pantheon, another mental distress that is interpreted in a variety of ways, or the removal of his divine spark by other immortals. He is often called Lorkhan, and his epitaphs are many, equally damnable and devout. This last line is particularly interesting in the context of the penultimate quest of Oblivion main story, in the player character's journey through Mankar Camoran's paradise. Camoran tries to go for some dramatic reveal, as the villains often do for some reason. He tries to convince you, the player, that Mehrunes Dagon, the Lord of Destruction, is actually Lorkhan, the missing god of Tamrielic pantheon, coming back to his realm of reality to claim what is rightfully his. A lot of discussion sprang from that back in the day, with some people thinking it's all just insane ramble of a shattered mind of Camoran, others thinking there might be something to it. So a few redditors helped me to make my mind about that, but this guy here made the best point in my opinion.
Now, the 9 Divines we know almost nothing about. One of the things that Bethesda has always been very good about is basically not telling us anything about the Divines. We know a lot about the Daedric Lords and the way they work and the way they function. Tons of stuff to speculate on there. We know almost nothing about the 9, or the 8, or whatever you want to call it. My biggest theory is and always has been the fact that they are in fact Daedric Lords themselves. Whether or not Mankar Camoran was correct is something that people have been debating for years, ever since Oblivion came out. We still don't actually know. Is Tamriel actually one of the planes of Oblivion? Was it separated by the Divines? Was the whole thing did the whole thing with Lorkhan actually happen, etc.? We don't know. He could have just been spouting hot air, or he could have been wrong, or he could have been insane, or any combination of the above. We don't know. Personally, however, I've always felt that he was absolutely correct. It explains a lot of things about the way Tamriel works. I mentioned earlier my theory that the Divines are Daedra. Well, if that's true, why don't they have more of a presence? The Daedric Lords have never hidden from anybody. They have shrines all over the place. They have no problem communicating with people, even personally in some circumstances. They have no problem, actually physically making a presence and making themselves known. There's no ambiguity there. You know Sheogorath exists because he's right there and he's talking to you. It's a lot more debatable with the Divines. The Divines have always been a more faith-based thing. We think they're there, we know there's certain powers that come from them, so there is evidence that they exist, kind of, yet not really. Kind of a weird situation. What if the Aedra have gone out of their way to do what the Daedric Lords have not? What if they claimed this plane of Oblivion jointly, which has never been done elsewise, and then agreed in order to allow it to flourish and grow on its own, What I mean by that is, I mentioned earlier that, a Daedric Lord would use a mortal on Tamriel as their agent, rather than one of their own mortals or their own Daedra, because those guys would be limited. That's because anyone actually living on the plane a Daedric Lord is manifested on, it is their plane, whether they know it or not, is basically being adhered to the doctrine of that Daedric Lord. There's a reason why the Shivering Isles look the way they do. There's a reason the Cold Harbor looks the way it does. Literally, the landscape and the terrain and the people and the animals all literally, physically change, as well as mentally and spiritually and energy-wise and whatever else, actually change to adhere to whatever it is that Daedric Lord represents. Now, this is fact. There's no denying this point. This is not theory. So, getting into the theory side of things, what if the Aedra said, we're just going to let the world do its own thing? No doctrine, no adherence. You don't have to. We were going to go out of our way to separate ourselves from this world, which is why they don't present themselves and contact themselves, because they can't. They've cut the connection.
I would add that whether or not Mankar was right and wasn't just rambling like a madman he was, it doesn't really make that much of a difference for the interpretation. And I think that because whether or not Dagon is Lorkhan, Tamriel is not bound to the will of any Daedric Lord the same way all the Daedric realms are, and therefore is always susceptible to change, death and rebirth, the cycle of consecutive empires, conflicting religions, and all the stuff you'd expect from a living world. Tamriel is an ever-changing place, like our own world. Change is one of the most characteristic features of literally everything we know. It's impossible to imagine the world without change. And Dagon stands for change. Change exists in time. It is also impossible to imagine a world where there is no flow of time, because then how would any change happen? It's a bit simplistic, but my point here is just that Mehrunes, Dagon and Akatosh are not polar opposites. They represent the aspects of reality that could not exist without each other. So whether you believe in what Mankar states about Dagon being Lorkhan, Dagon still represents similar ideas that Lorkhan would, metaphorically. So it would be fair to say that Mehrunes Dagon is not just a figure of evil in anything else than just aesthetics. It would be fair to say that the whole story isn't about the battle of good and evil. It would be fair to say, but it's not exactly true. Dagon wants to take or retake Tamriel to shape it in his own image. That will to subjugate reality is rather satanic in nature. In Christian tradition, at least, humans are created with the power of free will and the ability to name stuff like animals and plants and rivers. And, for example, J.R.R. Tolkien saw this as a metaphor for using speech creatively, storytelling, myth-making, literature, and all the like. This mirrors the Monomyth's ideas, with the Aedra letting Tamriel be diverse and distant from their influence, burdening the mortal races with the responsibility and freedom of choice. Dagon does the opposite, as all the Daedric princes, who make their worlds in their own image. Like with Elduin in Skyrim, Dagon is an ancient being claiming the birthright to the world of men and mer, and like with Alduin, it brings the New Testament's idea of Satan to mind. Manichaeism had the view of evil similar to what Mankar tells us about Dagon. In that interpretation, the entire material world is created by the evil god, which leads to a rather pessimistic situation where the good can prevail over evil only by complete rejection of the material. To restore the light trapped in the evil material and thus restore the world of light, rejection of the material is necessary. I bet Dagon thinks of himself this way. Yeah, he's a good guy, he's just saving this world from some distortions. At least Mankar seems to think this way of Dagon. It is worth noting that Mythic Dawn is a secret conspiratorial organization extremely hostile towards the Empire, which also has a real-life history behind it. The Manichaean religion used to be persecuted by the Roman Empire, both the pagan and the Christian one. Accusations of conspiracy were pretty common against many secretive religious sects in the empire. Speaking of secret societies, the most direct real-life inspiration for the Mythic Dawn is likely to be the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which was established near the end of the 19th century. The Golden Dawn had a strict hierarchy of initiation based on the Masonic lodges, hence the weird recruitment process in Oblivion. All this gives Mythic Dawn this unique atmosphere of occult conspiracy, magical thinking, and pushing against the system. They are against the Empire, which is supported by the Aedric religion, and they want to overthrow it because they assume that religion is fundamentally false. Does it make the Mythic Dawn evil per se? Well, perhaps not, but the conflict here dives deep into some real-life divide between two types of religious/magical thinking, which were always at odds with each other. The Imperial Cult of the Nine resembles a pretty bog-standard Western approach to the higher realities. Well, we don't really know what gods or God want, but we assume they want the best for us. And the best for us comes with a price, unfortunately, because it necessitates freedom of choice, free will, so we will make many mistakes, and we will be always responsible for the fate of the world. But such is the will of the gods, and it's probably not very wise to oppose that. Meanwhile, the Mythic Dawn engages in something called theurgy, Theurgy is a broad term covering many spiritual practices. They are all based on the assumption that a human being can become one with the divine, and, at its most extreme, that a human can tell the higher beings what to do, compel them, even force to do our bidding. That's what Mankar Cameron in Oblivion promises to his followers. That's what he claims his paradise to be. All this may not be good enough to classify the Mythic Dawn as evil and their opponents as good. However, it's pretty darn close. Mythic Dawn is based on resentment, assuming that reality itself can be bent to their will, and glorifies destruction. If it's not evil, it certainly delves into some classic satanic tropes of Western literature. But perhaps before I make up my mind about how evil the Mythic Dawn truly are, I could reiterate on why the player's side are almost certainly the good guys. Telltale sign of this is the fact that the actual genuine hero is on the player's side. It's not the player's character though, it's Martin Septim. Martin Septim's story arc is an almost perfect representation of the hero's journey described by Jonathan Campbell in the book The Hero with a Thousand Faces. It's a basic story structure applicable to many modern stories as well as legends and myths of great many cultures. So the hero needs a reason to leave his or her home, sets out to achieve a goal, encounters trials which force him to undergo a change. As a result of these adventures, a hero obtains something of immense value, a treasure, an unique power, or wisdom. Some things always have to be sacrificed on the way to the treasure, but then if a hero survives, he or she gets back home and uses the treasure or wisdom to improve his or her home, community, sometimes to improve the world and humanity as such. Martin is forced to leave his home and his previous life by the sudden Daedric invasion. He encounters a reason to journey far from home, that reason being the hero of Kvatch. He starts his journey as a broken man, disillusioned, doubtful about gods and their ability or willingness to protect the world. But later on he discovers his unique destiny and learns to accept it.
Wait, yes. The amulet was given to mortals by Akatosh. It contains his divine power. But how to use this power against Dagon? The amulet was not intended as a weapon. I have an idea, one last hope. I must reach the Dragonfires and the Temple of the One. You'll just have to trust me. I know now what I was born to do, but I'll need your help. I have to get past Mehrunes Dagon somehow.
The wisdom he obtains is this: it doesn't matter if all that happens to him is part of a divine plan. What matters is what he can do, and what he decides to sacrifice in order to save the world. This is important because it sends us back to the main difference between the Aedra and the Daedra. That's why the Aedra are so far removed from the world, rarely intervening and, yes, often allowing for Tamriel to almost destroy itself. Because it's not the will of the gods that can save us, it's the forthright decision of the hero. It's free will and the necessity of sacrifice. That's the main reason to treat Martin as the good guy, one of the most spectacular, most goodies in the entire Elder Scrolls saga, at least within the classic definitions of good. It's so in your face that back in the day a lot of people complained about this story arc being cliché and old-fashioned and yada yada. I don't mind. Personally, stories like that will keep re-emerging all the time anyway. It's quite possible though that this particular cliché story is won by the baddies, seeing Mehrunes Dagon as the symbolic representation of change and revolution. Well, great change happened. The empire was crippled, the Dragonborn line of emperors severed, and the peoples of Tamriel are now entering a much darker era. At least some part of Mehrunes Dagon's ambitions are fulfilled. The gods have become even further removed from this world. It's quite possible that this is exactly what the gods themselves wanted from this world. You could say that Sauron won the War of the Ring in the Middle-earth, for example, because at least the elves were weakened and had to go and remove themselves from Middle-earth, leaving human race alone, devoid of elvish guidance. Tamriel faces a similar fate without the Dragonborn emperors. So I think that Sean Bean's summary at the end of the main quest is Spot on. The world is changed, but the goal was never to save the Emperor. It was to make place for new heroes and empires, to make new stories and give the men and Mer even more independence from the gods. Through the tragedy of the Oblivion crisis, Tamriel matures, like a hero who needs to sacrifice something to become a better hero. So even though it is a classic good versus evil story, light versus darkness, the two forces aren't polar opposites exactly. It's much more like in Goethe's Faustus, when the devil says, "I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good." Dagon wanted to show the Aedra who's the boss, but he ended up facilitating a change that the gods themselves would deem necessary. Well, maybe barring all the corpses and torture and stuff, you know. So, as with Skyrim, we have a lot of old Western tropes underlying the story. We have a Satan-like figure as the enemy, we have the hero's journey very well depicted, and we have a hopeful message of growing up, maturation, getting stronger through trials and challenges. Except this story is more focused on sacrifice. It might look more like a fairy tale, but the fundamental message is less optimistic than Skyrim's, actually. The sacrifice Martin Septim and Tamriel have to make in order to move forward is so traumatizing that the trauma will still be noticeable 200 years later. Well, it's a very typical Western heroic story then. They tend to be cheerful like that. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Let me know what else should I do here. Maybe Shivering Isles storyline, that would be cool. Subscribe, like, share and all that. You know what to do, right? Bye bye.